Should incumbent banks be launching their own banking-as-a-service initiatives? And why is banking-as-a-service so crucial for Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030? These are the two topics of today's Embedded Finance Review podcast. I'm speaking with Sophie Guibaud. She was the head of product strategy at Bankable, the MD at Fidor Solutions, the chief growth officer at OpenPaid, and is the founder of Fiat Republic. Additionally, Sophie has written a book about embedded finance. So as you can see, Sophie has a ton of experience with different banking-as-a-service companies, and she has recently founded her own boutique consultancy for B2B founders and executives. In this episode, I speak with Sophie about the opportunity for incumbent banks within banking-as-a-service and how she has experienced Saudi Arabia's fintech ecosystem since she moved there a couple of months ago. My name is Lars Markull, and this is the Embedded Finance Review podcast. Every 2 weeks, I'm interviewing the builders and shapers of embedded finance. Let's dive in. Hi, Sophie. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, and in what part of the world are you located right now?
Hi, Lars. Well, I'm doing great, thank you. And I am located in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where I relocated last year.
Interesting. And obviously, we will be talking about Saudi Arabia and fintech, specifically banking as a service, in some time as well. But maybe let's kick things off. I mentioned already in the introduction your long background in fintech, but also specifically in banking as a service. I wonder how, from your perspective, what we have seen over the last couple of years specifically, I mean, maybe in Europe, but also in the US and in other geographies, we have seen certain developments with banking as a service providers. Some are not doing well at all. Some are doing well, but overall, the market is a little bit like in question. What's your personal view on the landscape?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And before answering this question, I would like to tell you a bit about my background in banking as a service, because I think it's quite relevant to answer that. So basically, I started 13 years ago at Bankable. And back then, we were enabling FinTech to launch and unbundle the bank. I'm pretty sure you remember that period. And then there has been like the period where actually banks wanted to fight back and launch their own neobanks. And that was another kind of banking as a service. And it's what I did with Fidor. And then there was like the next evolution of banking as a service, where literally all tech platforms wanted to integrate some kind of payments. Doesn't have to be cards or anything, but to collect funds from their users and to send money to their providers. And it's what I did at Fiat Republic when we launched an offering that was targeting specifically crypto institutions. So overall, like banking as a service that was born around 2010 to some extent, has been very much evolving according to the needs of the markets and development, specifically in Europe and US. And I think while back then we were looking at empowering like the launch of fintechs with full been sponsoring card programs, etc., we are now looking at banking as a service that first is much more diversified, but also digital, API-based, can only be focused on payments or on deposits or on lending, but also like a variety of banking as a service providers or payments platforms that focus on specific niche. So specifically focused on e-commerce or on crypto like Fiat Republic. And I think that there is like space for all players in the market because, for example, banks would have difficulty creating like specific offering for specific segments, can provide more like API, like general API, while those providers are really answering pain points on the market. So that would be the first thing. Second, like there has been definitely a development of embedded finance. A few years ago, I remember we were talking about this 7.4 billion market. I think it's Simon Torrance that created this number. And the proposition I've been definitely developing, but I think with different flavors across the world, specifically in the GCC where I am currently, there has been a massive uptake when it comes to BNPL, which like massive companies such as Tabi and Tamara that have taken the market by storm, basically, and are providing now BNPL to many different providers. I think we have seen also more and more regulatory scrutiny when it comes to banking as a service, as you have just mentioned. And I think it's just a natural evolution of things because banking as a service has created itself organically when basically fintech needed support to launch faster and at a lower cost, right? they have been regulated on the go by regulators, but I believe what we have seen in the past few years is that maybe like the extent of the use case that are being developed have grown faster than what was expected. And so regulatory control and regulatory frameworks needs to be adapted, taking that into account. And well, I believe that's what like FCA, European regulators, as well as US regulators are looking at. And last point on the US, because also I think it's like one to mention. So there has been like also some regulatory scrutiny when it comes to the US. Also, there has been massive innovation when it comes to banking as service, like with different type of providers, such as like Green Dot doing it all, players like Unit or Modern Treasury or Treasury Prime that are like aggregating different APIs and different banks under them. Pure banking as a service players as well, and banks that have been diversifying, such as Cross River in banking as service. And so this ecosystem has been living, but I think like given like the economic context currently and like the push on fintech and cryptocurrency in particular, like we should see quite a lot of evolution when it comes to banking as service. And like the news that Stripe is going for a bank charter in Georgia is showing that it's happening right now.
Yeah. I mean, you did mention quite a few different players who you can probably put in or who are in the banking as a service, or who can be quite categorized as a banking as a service provider. When you hear the term banking as a service provider, is it for you like pretty clear, like maybe 10 years ago? Yeah, what I understood, I think what I felt like is like 10, 15 years ago when somebody said like banking as a service provider, you kind of knew exactly what this is. Today is like, can be a lot of things. You have to ask like 3 or 4 or 5 follow-up questions to exactly understand what this company is exactly doing with the target customers. Is that correct from your perspective? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So banking as service, as I was mentioning, has been evolving with what the market needs, but large range of provider catering with. For like clients with financial licenses, others with no financial licenses, either working as a bank sponsors, being a bank themselves, having an EMI license, or just being a tech partner. And I think like if you go back to what banking as a service is literally enabling any company to launch financial service proposition, which ranges from cards to accounts, to international payments, to deposits, to lending. And basically, so like enabling to launch these different things, but then like the offering themselves vary a lot, whether they provide it in white label or just through APIs, whether they provide customer onboarding, like in the US, it's like pretty mainstream because it's the only way to do banking as a service. Way in Europe, you can do more of KYC, KYB delegation, who's providing the balance sheets, etc. So no, the answer is like banking as a service is still pretty complicated. I think like as a player, if you're looking to launch banking as a service, it's about defining what target market you're going after, what problem you're answering, and designing your proposition based on that. Also, in what regulations you're playing with. Is KYC delegation possible or not? Which then means, do you need to do operations for those companies or not? And start it from there. And as someone that wants to launch embedded finance or use banking as a service, it's about also wondering, like looking at the market, the different options, and see what fits to your organization. Some organizations want to become FinTechs. I believe it's like what we saw when Booking and made this announcement a few years ago. So here, like they better have like a regulatory part on their end, like looking at getting the license, etc. But some people just want to tap into their audience, increase the loyalty of their audience, as well, make, of course, extra revenues, but don't want to get their hands dirty. And that also is possible. So every time it's about starting, who are we trying to serve and what we are trying to achieve.
In a way, you could say the variety of providers these days is both a great advantage and disadvantage for those companies looking to work with these providers. On the one hand, you have now like so many more options. It's not just the one size fits all. You have now all the different variety of providers. But on the other hand, you need to find the right one. So specifically, if you're maybe not a fintech, you're a non-financial brand who wants to launch a banking product. Now you have like these 10, 20 providers next to each other. And I see it myself as well. very often the assumption they're all the same. I basically look at, I don't know, like price and a few other things to compare, but then you realize very often, like much later, that they're actually like quite different. And then B is also maybe a little bit of a disadvantage of like, it's harder to also guess which one of these providers will be around for like much longer. Yes, some of these are very mature and you can kind of guess that they will be available one way or another. But if you now bet on the next like kind of like out of stealth banking as a service provider, then obviously it's also a challenge. Is the model best for you? Yeah, okay. But is the model also big enough that this company can succeed? That's another question. But I guess it's like a pro and con for the buyers out there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. If I was a brand wanting to go into embedded finance, I would definitely either hire internally or use, support like you, Lars, to help navigate the markets, because what you don't know can really put you in a bad state because you realize last minute, oh, it's missing that. Oh, I need to create a whole department of doing those things, etc. And like basically going much higher when it comes to cost. When it comes to financial stability, I believe that the 101 of looking for any kind of provider in general doesn't have to be banking as a service. And when it comes to like the stability of the banking as a service model, so yeah, like it has definitely been put into question, but I believe that the current prospect with high interest rates brings much more upside than it had been in like a negative interest rate scenario, right? So there is a need for the service. Indeed, unfortunately, users have been used to not pay for banking, but how they paid for banking was by putting their funds in and like the bank placing the money elsewhere, right? Now, banking as service providers, even if they don't have like the banking license, are in a state where they can still get interest from the banks they are working with, and makes it a much more interesting model, of course.
And among the different names that you mentioned as banking as a service providers, there were a couple of them also. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of ways you can separate them and put them in different buckets. One important one is obviously a license that they use or like the regulatory background. I think you mentioned Green Dot Bank in the US already, which is an interesting model with like banking as a service, but also approaching the customers directly. In Europe, I mean, none of us is right now in Europe, so I cannot say here in Europe, but in Europe, obviously, we have seen now in the last couple of years, a few more banks doing something in banking as a service. Maybe from my perspective, most importantly, like SEB from Scandinavia, who launched SEB Embedded. Then obviously there is Vodeno on two sides, the partnership with NatWest and now the acquisition from UniCredit. So we're seeing some banks, some European banks getting more actively involved in like directly banking as a service, also serving some of the unregulated players. I think it's quite obvious that a lot of banks already work with regulated players quite often in some cases, but now it's also more with unregulated players. What's your view on that? Because if you look at fintech in general, I think what we always see in the industry is moving fast, but then also slow at the same time. And banks, very often traditional banks, and when I say banks, I mean traditional banks, had the chance to kind of catch up while customers got used to the new fintech solution and they could improve their apps and stuff like that. So I wonder, in banking as a service, can banks also catch up with the standalone venture VC-funded startup banking service providers? Or what's your view on traditional banks and banking as a service?
It's a good question. So first of all, I think like we need to talk about like the diversity of different things. So like you have like the challenger banks, such as like a Sterling Bank, pretty easy for them to deploy such a solution. There was Monies as well. I mean, they are tech companies. They are like startups or former startups that have grown into the next stage, but quite used to a fast-paced ecosystem, understanding like fintechs, designing products, etc. So it's like, I think there is this first type of banks. Then there has been like the pure banking as service players, such as like, I think Solaris is one of big example. Like ClearBank in the UK is also one of them. It's companies that do that like from just an industrial basis. It's just what they do. So for those two categories, I mean, it's a no-brainer because they have the tech, they are attractive to like the fintechs and the brands, they have the reliability, they have the balance sheet as well. And then like you have this category of incumbent banks. And even in the incumbent banks category, like there has been, as you have been just mentioning, very large banks that have found a way to launch a banking as service proposition to answer specific needs on the market. For them, I think generally it's like a first mover advantage, like the first one there, like, or the first two ones will get the market. But generally, I think they have like a lot to bring to the market because they are established, they have the balance sheet, they have the license to also convince the regulators that like what they will do is reliable, but they also provide operations as a service. And when you launch, for example, a retail proposition where you need like a lot of KYC, like loan origination and that type of thing, it's invaluable. However, it's not something easy to execute. Like having lived that back in the days with Fidor, we were a tech bank, community bank, became a banking as a service provider a bit, not by chance, but it's just because people loved so much what we had done that they wanted to replicate it. And that's how we became a banking as a service provider. And back then, like even for a tech company like us, there was like a culture adaptation that needs to be done, like from serving retail customers to jumping into professional services, like serving B2B, doing tech projects, even like teaching the bank people to do KYC of customers, like a second line customer service, sometimes first line customer service. So it means that for a bank to jump into the, or incumbent bank to jump into the banking as a service bank wagon, there is an opportunity, but the execution, and it can be done, the execution just needs to be crafted super powerfully.
What do you think of then you touched on a few points. I wonder like I do agree with, having worked in an embedded banking / banking as a service provider before as well. Of course, I can imagine like doing the same activities for a bank is not like it's not so easy either. But I always felt like working for like a standalone provider with an e-money license. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Like in Germany, if I'm doing sales, I can say like the regulated party behind me is like a Deutsche Bank or a Sparkasse, like a savings bank. It would be so much easier, right? But of course, then you have other challenges, right? And for me, like the one challenge that I haven't been involved too many of these projects, but like the one thing I would probably say is like super hard to figure out is like, how is this new unit compared to the rest of the activities, right? Because in a way, it's like, it's a strategic change, right? And whenever we see Moniz was a good example, you mentioned them as well. Whenever you venture like in this new area, it's like, how are you going to make it work, right? Because you have like two very different things together. So I wonder if that's the biggest challenge for banks or if you see something else as well.
I think it's like the biggest challenge. Back then with Fidor, what we did was to put Fidor Solutions in a separate office, but an office that was literally 15 seconds from the other office. But also by putting some people from Fidor Bank into Fidor Solutions and hiring new people that were tech providers. So really blending both expertise so that the new tech people back into the bank's culture, but also what is a bank and what are the constraints, but also for like the existing bank people used to serve retail to make them understand what it is to actually serve a company such as O2 that we were doing back in the day. So that's the biggest challenge. I think like there is also to some extent discussions to have this between buy versus build for those banks. I think like the partnership or purchase of Trésor by Société Générale is an example of something working super well. Trésor has been existing for a very long time, owning a big part of the French market, and Société Générale purchased them and providing the license support as well as the balance sheets. But also Société Générale having the deep expertise of buying company and not killing them, basically. But that is also, I think, in the boardroom. If you, as a bank, are considering banking as a service, it's something like that you need to ask yourself, not what's the best or the easiest, it's more what's the best for my organization, based on my culture, based on my operations, what's most likely to work. So yeah, it's not about only doing it yourself. It can be using another external provider to help you do that, but it also can be buying an existing player.
But do you see at the moment, I'm not sure if you have to limit it to Europe, but like generally, do you see banks do you see this trend becoming more of a thing? Banks moving stronger into banking as a service? I guess US is completely different because of no e-money license regulation available. So banks have to do that.
To just become a bank.
Exactly. This is a bank becoming itself as a startup is very hard. So obviously, specifically community banks, smaller banks had always a strong incentive and they kind of needed to do it. But like in Europe or other geographies, do you see like right now is a time where banks are doing it or will it still take some time?
No, so I think it depends on the geographies, and that's an excellent point. I think, first of all, you have just mentioned two examples, like in the past couple of years with UniCredit and like the Nordic Bank. So there is still interest on specific geographies. But as I mentioned, first mover advantage. And like in Europe, we are well served when it comes to banking as a service. There is lots of players. And as you rightly mentioned, because regulation enabled to do so. However, in some geographies, such as my beloved Saudi market, there is, Vision 2030, which is basically the innovation economic growth program of the Crown Prince MBS to grow Saudi even more. One of the main pillars is to have 525 FinTechs by 2030. And they are doing pretty well. I think they are at around 250. I think it's a bit more, but it means that in just a few years, they have reached that target. And they are in the first evolution of when it comes to FinTech, because even like the first models of FinTechs are being launched, right? Like there are also more advanced ones, but just things such as BNPL. However, it takes time to become a FinTech, like to get your licenses, etc. And so I believe that in Saudi specifically, there is definitely a first mover advantage for a bank to become a banking as a service player, enable this new ecosystem of FinTech, like enabling it to grow in accordance to Vision 2030, but also enabling like established players like and brands to do embedded finance. So now the question again is, do they do it themselves? Or do they take banking and service providers from abroad and just like plug license and balance a sheet? I think everything can be done, but there is a strong opportunity for those banks, and the benefits is for sure extra revenue and not free distribution, but like tapping into audiences that are just not yours, right? So there are strong benefits. It's all about execution as usual. And I'm pretty excited about what's going to come next. I think it's going to happen.
Sophie, you have been basically like super early in banking as a service in Europe, and like you mentioned, you shifted to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia. If you compare the two markets, maybe not so much FinTech in general, but specifically like banking as a service, do you see some similarities to what you maybe have seen in Europe at the beginning? Like how much has Saudi Arabia already moved towards like a banking as a service model?
Yeah, so it's super interesting as a question. So it's a mix, I would say. Up to recently, one of the ways to launch FinTech propositions was to do it through Visa, MasterCard, card program, wallets, etc. It's exactly what I was doing at Bankable in 2012. So it's how banking as a service started in Europe. And it was when FinTech were here to embed the bank. And that's pretty much what's happening right now in KSA. Difference is that KSA is going faster and embedded lending is already here. Like they are already category leaders there. And also people are more digital. They are more accustomed now to use all those services. So it's really a mix. But the FinTech propositions definitely have been starting the way we started them back in the days. But the reason why is just because the infrastructure is not there yet. There is, just by the way, there is instant payment here. And like there is also the best experience when it comes to KYC, because it's all linked to the government. So it's just like the FinTech providers just need to plug to the platform and pay, but they can get you your ID. So you open a bank account here, even from Challenger Bank, you just need to open an app and it's done. It's just amazing. So I think there is definitely things that are more streamlined and enable a better experience, even versus what we have currently in Europe and in the UK.
And like the way you described it, like how currently like FinTech products are being built. Specifically looking like at banking as a service providers that maybe, not plenty of them are there, but I guess like some of them are there already in one way or another. Again, like comparing it to what we said before, are they focusing like today on like FinTech clients, or is there already something like an embedded finance movement where non-financial brands, maybe the local or car ride company or restaurant apps to provide financial services as well?
The one that comes to mind is definitely Nimcart that just raised a massive round, and they cater for all different use cases. And it's not a surprise because, again, here banking is free, right? So free to the extent, again, that you put your funds and they like the bank gets better like interest. That's what they give you. But basically, like Nimcart offers much more than just banking. Like there is the cards. So here also they get they get interchange, a decent amount. They do lending as well. So the business, so they cater to on fintech, but also like brands in general. But what's striking is that they have like a better chance to make, I think, banking as service work in terms of model just by the fact that they are getting interchange. And by the way, I'm not a pro interchange for companies and for users. It's just different markets, like as in Asia and in the US, interchange is higher and like companies can just generate revenues out of it.
And you did mention the goal of the regulator or the country to achieve like a certain number of fintechs by 2030. Are you aware, like, is there like a public, maybe even like known, some kind of like plan how to achieve it? I guess, obviously it requires funding, a lot of like infrastructure. I'm wondering, does it also mean that, you can assume that if you want to build a fintech company, obviously very early, you might need support of like banks or regulated companies. So it sounds like maybe specifically banking as a service as a concept should be pushed in the country to actually achieve that goal, because you might not like miraculously achieve 500 fintech startups just because you're asking for it, but the right infrastructure, of course, needs to be there as well, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. It's my strong belief. And I believe also it's like what Sama has in mind. But you are mentioning like what steps have been taken. It's actually, they have created a whole ecosystem. So there is FinTech Saudi, which is a bit the equivalent of Innovate Finance, but really empowering the fintechs. Hundreds of millions have been committed to that. And there are maybe a couple things to mention that I think are super interesting. So first of all, they have created a financial academy to catch up on fintech skills. And it's kind of the basics, but we never had that. And I just find it's like a super smart way to upskill people. Generally as well, like there is really this willingness to bring in people that have the experience to pass on the experience to people locally. And I think it's like also a great approach. And I expect more fintech entrepreneurs from the outside to come soon here, given the size of the opportunity, because like there are so many fintechs to launch, like there are opportunities, you just need to pick one and just execute, right? And the last thing is that regulator is looking at super cool stuff. So one of them that they have deployed is called Macken, and it provides to the fintechs an ecosystem of everything as kind of they need to launch. So they help them with SOC 3, they help them with cloud stuff, they help them with like the different requirements, they provide the required support. I also saw there is like 1 million grants per startup for startup going into the cloud. So yes, in short is that they have understood very well that ecosystem and infrastructure is key. And they are not only looking at what has been done outside, but just creating their own thing. And I think the Macan program is one of the leading example of that. And that actually all countries should look at.
I think that's an interesting point that I'm making, right? We spoke about that. I'm in India right now as well, in Mumbai. I actually was here last year as well. There was a big fintech conference where I attended. It was like, I think the size of a Money 2020, like 80,000 people. And there was actually a pavilion, like a big booth of the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, which is basically the local regulator over here. And they basically showcased some of the things that they are supporting and working on. And of course, me as a German, my first thinking was like, when do I going to see a booth of BaFin at? They are present to be shared at some of these events, right? But in that landscape or in that size, I think you mentioned as well, I would assume that the regulator in Saudi Arabia is also taking these things a complete different level, right? Because it's more of a growth mindset and need to support these things, where in Europe, for a reason perhaps, but in Europe very often it's more about like protection and safety and control and rather lesser innovation, but proper for everybody. And in countries like this, it's completely opposite. But maybe following up on that, then do you have you didn't speak about it, but do you have an expectation now? Like now we know the goal for Saudi Arabia was 2030 and it's well progressing. Now you also described the bank as a service in the region is still like, let's say far behind, whatever, compared to like Western markets. How do you see that? I know crystal ball is always a great question, but like 10, 20 years from now, do you think this could be at one point where some of these geographies are also overtaking Europe and the US in development, and we're going to see completely unique own development? And maybe at one point, we in the sense of like Europe and US can learn from these markets. Maybe right now it's rather the other way around. Maybe at one point this will be turned around.
So I believe embedded finance will be everywhere here, because it's just like people are so digital, like using WhatsApp every day, like all the different apps, like it's just different mindsets. So I think there is definitely a need. And it means that definitely there is also a need to enable this ecosystem. I just think it might be different to the extent that I think the regulator will be looking at what have been the learnings of the different other regulators across the world and trying to have a different maybe take when it comes to banking as service and as a result embedded finance. And that's why I believe that specifically in Saudi, there's a need for the banks to take a stance to really enable that. And again, it can be by themselves or through a partnership, could be partnerships again with the EMIs. But I have the feeling it needs to be much more a move forward than what we have seen in Europe and in the UK, where banks have been kind of dragged into it. But, taking maybe a more passive role. Here, I feel banks can take a much more active role for their benefits and the benefits of their shareholders as well. And eventually the benefits of users, of course.
Understood. And Sophie, we spoke a lot about banking as a service in Europe and also banking as a service, of course, now in Saudi Arabia and everything around it. I heard a bit about your background as well, so maybe you're quite curious to hear, what are you working on these days? I mean, now, obviously, you shifted geographies, focusing on a completely new market. What's your focus these days?
Yeah, so I am now basically advising B2B fintech founders and on everything coming to sales and marketing, and I'm also helping banks launch embedded finance and banking as a service. So basically staying in the sector I love, but globally as well. I definitely want to have an impact on Saudi because I am very happy here. I like the dynamism of the country. I like the dynamism of the people and their hunger on making things happen and making things big. But it doesn't mean that I cannot keep on getting involved in the markets. I know as well, Europe, UK, US, and beyond as well. This portfolio approach, I find it super nourishing because being able to work on such a variety of different topics and keeping on learning from different markets, but propositions as well, etc.
Amazing. Sophie, thank you so much for sharing some insights. Obviously, we could have gone a lot deeper in all these areas, but maybe we leave that for a second episode or so, where we pick one specific topic to dive deeper. Thanks for sharing your insights.
I had so much fun.
Glad to hear that. And if there's somebody out there who wants to chat with you, is there a good way to reach out to you, to pick you up for a one-to-one conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So LinkedIn would be the best. So Sophie Guibaud. So basically that's the best and I will get back.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sophie. And until next time. Thanks for listening. For more content, please visit embeddedfinancereview.com. And by the way, I'm spending the next few weeks in India. If you know an interesting embedded finance company from here or anywhere else in the world that I should interview, please send them my way. Until next time.